Good evening. This is one of the ongoing educational programs provided for the library by the Riviera Camera Club. Riviera is one of the oldest camera clubs in Indianapolis, approaching 70 years old. The mission is to provide a place where people passionate about photography can expand their interests and skills by motivating and learning from each other. If you're watching this program, you're invited to check out the Riviera Club on rivieracamera.org. And feel free to attend the meeting. We hope to be meeting again in purpose in July in the Central Library. My name is Michael Jack. I've been the liaison for the library for the educational programs, but this responsibility will be assumed by Rona Schwartz, who's also on this recording. Susan Ross, who's also a Riviera member, will be the first presenter covering smartphone and regular camera differences for photography. I will do a short presentation on composition basics following that. Susan's a real smartphone connoisseur. She may have close to a record number of iPhone apps on her phone. She's also an incredible digital camera photographer and a post-processing expert. She majored in art, which is evident in her photography. She's been photographing and doing visual arts for many years. Both Rona and Susan's works are just amazing. So I'm delighted at this point to turn the program over to Susan.
So in this program, we're going to look at the differences between creating photographs with a smartphone camera versus a DSLR or mirrorless camera. And comparing the two is kind of like comparing cats and dogs. While they make great companions, they are genetically different. And it's the same with the smartphone and DSLR cameras. As much as they perform the same basic function of capturing a photo, they are genetically different by design. Photography is in a really interesting place right now. The technological advances that have been made by smartphone makers have a lot of people wondering if their smartphone is actually good enough or even as good as a dedicated camera. But serious photographers know they're not. The quality that you get from a smartphone camera can be good enough depending on what you're using it for, and is good enough going to be the new normal. So with each generation of smartphones adding more features, higher resolutions, and expanding their high quality video, there is a legitimate argument for the average person not needing a real camera. So why would you use a smartphone as your dedicated camera? It's convenient. It's usually always with you. It's lightweight. It fits in your pocket. They're uncomplicated and very easy to use. You open your camera app, you point at your subject, and you tap a button. Your images are immediately available. Photos taken with smartphone cameras are easier to share with your friends, family, and social media. There's an enormous, as Michael mentioned, I have as many apps as anyone, but there's an amazing variety of photo editing apps that let you play with color saturation, add stickers, or add filters like vintage mode or light leaks to your photos. There's location access. This is kind of a handy feature to have turned on in your settings, because this will allow you to import your GPS coordinates with the image, so it allows you to revisit a site easily. Smartphones have a variety of capture modes. There's regular standard mode, portrait, night, pano, video, slow motion, time lapse. So let's take a look at some different photos that were shot with a smartphone. So the image on the right was shot with an iPhone 12 Pro Max, and to the left of the image is all of the data that was captured. This particular phone had the location access on, so you see a map, you can see exactly where it was taken. This image was taken with a smartphone. It was an iPhone 8 Plus, and the location services were not on. This image was shot in standard photo mode. The image on the left was shot in standard camera mode with the telephoto function on, and the one on the right was shot in portrait mode. This image was shot using the standard camera on live mode so that I could actually go in and get that blur of something that was moving through the frame. Same type of thing. This was also shot in live mode to give that long exposure look. This image was shot with the pano mode. And this one with a standard camera in night mode. Just another image of the night mode setting. Here are a couple of examples of indoor photography with a smartphone. And the image on the left was converted to black and white or monochrome. So is a smartphone capable of being a replacement for a DSLR or mirrorless? It's the marketing hype that smartphone makers do best. And are they actually really capable of being a replacement for a DSLR from Nikon or Canon, or a mirrorless from Sony or Olympus? From the perspective of a professional photographer with high-end gear, the answer is absolutely not. You will not see professional photographers using smartphones as their maiden camera at a wedding or a sporting event. But amateur photographers, parents, teens, anyone else, could an average person with little to no formal training really take better pictures with a DSLR camera than with a modern smartphone? And why would they want to? So why would you want to use a mirrorless or DSLR? Of the two cameras shown here, the one on the left is a body of a mirrorless camera. The one on the right is a DSLR. Both show the scene through the camera lens itself as you compose the picture. But the way they display it is a little different. The DSLR, SLR stands for single lens reflex. That design was invented long before digital sensors, when the only way to show the view through the camera lens was to use a mirror in the body to reflect the image of the scene up onto an optical viewfinder. When you take the picture, the mirror flips up so that the image can then pass through the back of the camera where the film is, or in the case of a DSLR, the digital sensor. That's how the exposure works. Mirrorless cameras don't have a mirror. The image passes straight through to the sensor on the back of the camera, which passes a live feed to the electronic viewfinder. So they can dispense with the need for a mirror and an optical viewfinder. This is one of the main reasons why the mirrorless camera bodies you can see here is a lot smaller than the DSLR. Both types of cameras have differences, but it's kind of beyond the scope of this presentation. If you're going to look at them, make sure you ask a lot of questions. One of the huge advantages to having a DSLR or mirrorless camera are lenses. Although smartphones are good at taking pictures, they're terrible in terms of lens optics. If you own a DSLR or mirrorless, you'll appreciate how often you can swap out your lens. This is probably the most obvious difference between DSLRs and a mobile camera. Smartphones, however, do not have this ability at all. Yes, you can attach external lenses to your phone's camera, but these come nowhere near what you can achieve with a proper camera lens. And then again, too, smartphone lenses and accessories often become obsolete with new phone versions. As smartphones are very capable, they try their best to replicate this through their artificial intelligence. And yes, you can get the job done, but it's nowhere near as effective as swapping a lens. So let's start with standard lenses. Standard lenses have a mid-range focal length, which is basically what your smartphone has. Usually it's between 35 and 85 millimeter. These lenses offer a fairly accurate representation of what the human eye sees. As a result, the images are perceived as more natural than those taken with other types of camera lenses. They're also known as normal lenses, so their human-like viewpoint is especially valuable in documentary projects such as street, portrait, and travel photography. So this is an example of an image that was shot with a 50 millimeter prime or standard lens. And we have telephoto lenses. Telephoto lenses have long focal lengths starting at usually around 85 millimeters and allow you to photograph subjects from a distance. They are significantly heavier and bigger than other types of lenses, and more often than not require the use of camera accessories such as tripods or monopods. Since depth of field being the area of sharpness is inversely proportional to the focal length, these lenses produce very narrow focal planes. This makes short telephoto lenses 85 to 135 millimeters especially useful when you're doing portraits, as the background can appear completely blurred. In other types of photography, they offer the ability to get close-up shots from a significant distance away. This is what makes these lenses so popular with sports and wildlife photographers. So here's an example of an image that was taken with a 600 millimeter lens. And we have wide angle. Wide angle lenses are those with a short focal length. They commonly range from 14 to 35 millimeter. The broader field of view allows you to capture more of the scene in a single exposure. Because of this, wide angle lenses are particularly popular in architectural and landscape photography. Another one of their key features of these type of camera lenses is the ability to create a large depth of field. Again, that area of sharpness. This allows a photographer to capture shots where most of the scene is razor sharp. On the downside, you'll have, with the shorter focal length, is there's a little more distortion that you'll see. And this is an example of an image that was shot with a 14 millimeter wide angle lens. And you have fisheye lenses. Fisheye lenses are ultra wide with a focal length between 4 and 14 millimeters. They're most commonly used for like abstract photography, just because of the unique mapping that gives an image like a convex appearance that distorts straight lines. And here's an image that was shot with a fisheye. We also have macro lenses. Macro lenses have a unique internal structure that allows them to capture close-up with accurate detail, sharpness, and contrast. The purpose of this type of lens is to display subjects at life size, one-to-one. They're primarily used to capture beautiful nature photos, but also significantly popular in fields such as product and fine art photography. The focal length of macro lenses usually varies between 35 and 200 millimeters. This is an example of an image that was shot with a 105 macro. Another difference between smartphone cameras and DSLR mirrorless is the resolution. The resolution of photos taken on a standard camera is much greater than the resolution of smartphone cameras, thanks to the larger sensors that can number up to 60 megapixels or more. More megapixels does not mean a better photo, though, let's be clear, but that brings me to the next point. The sensors in dedicated cameras are much larger than smartphone cameras, and that means they can let a lot more light in and produce better photos with greater dynamic range. So let's take a look at some of the camera sensor sizes. This is the main thing that separates the DSLR mirrorless from the smartphone. Because of the bigger sensor, the more light it can receive. and that in turn makes for better pictures. A small sensor is one of the reasons that smartphones don't perform well in poor lighting. And the sensor is the backbone of any digital camera. Smartphone image sensor is roughly 20 times smaller than a standard camera, and that's huge, huge difference. Smartphone manufacturers focus a lot on their megapixel count, as most people know when they go out to buy one, making people think that the number of megapixels is the most important thing about a camera. Even though a standard camera, DSLR, or mirrorless could pack way more pixels, than they already do, they don't. And that's because having a larger number of them is good for pixel resolution. But there's something else that's also important, and it's the size of the pixel. The bigger the pixel, the more light it can capture. This is part of why, even though you may have a smartphone camera and DSLR with the same megapixel count, the image, if you shot the same image, it would be nowhere near the same. The camera with the bigger pixel size will likely come out on top. To better understand this, think of pixels as buckets that catch rainwater. Rainwater represents light in this analogy. A big bucket will catch more rainwater than a tiny cup. And the good thing about large pixels is they're not prone to digital noise like smaller pixels are. So this is an exploded view of a smartphone sensor. Mobile phones are made to be handheld. So this means the sensor can't be too big. That's why you'll see a sliver of a lens when compared to an actual digital camera. It might be handy, but it's not if you want to take great low light shots. Amazing low light shots can only be taken if the camera sensor is huge. Phone manufacturers are trying to resolve this issue. That's why you see low light shots from phones like Pixel or iPhone that do have amazing low light capabilities in night mode. It can take still shots almost on par with your digital camera. Although close, it's still, as we'll see later, it still doesn't win the race. And we've only talked about still shots. So if you're trying to take a picture in dim light with a moving subject, it's just not even possible. So this is the DSLR sensor. And going back to the bucket and the rainwater analogy, if you've ever collected rainwater before, you'll know that the water you collect is not entirely clean. Some dirt settles at the bottom of the container. This wouldn't be too much of a problem if you have a large bucket because you still have a lot of good water to use. Rainwater collected in a small cup is very little, so having dirt is a problem, and it brings down the water to dirt ratio. So this is why smartphone cameras don't perform as well as DSLRs, because their pixels are small and they can't capture enough light if the lighting conditions are poor. With large pixels found in standard cameras, you can get great shots in all types of lighting. So this is the sensor location on a mirrorless camera. And this is the location and size of the sensor in the DSLR, and you can see the mirror actually in front of the screen, the sensor in this shot. So the advantages to a larger sensor. Just to recap, larger sensors generally provide higher resolution. They result in improved low light performance, and the dynamic range will likely be increased with a large image sensor. The larger sensor lets you create background blur. Another difference that you have are the shooting modes in a standard camera, and understanding camera shooting modes can make a real difference in the quality of your image. Most all of these cameras have a program mode. Program mode is like a semi-automatic mode. It's sometimes used when people are just beginning to learn the functions of their camera. The camera still controls most of the functions, but you're able to control the ISO being the brightness or darkness of an image. the white balance, which is the balance of temperature of the colors in the image you're taking, and the flash. Program mode will then automatically adjust the shutter speed and aperture settings to work with the other settings you've created, making this one of the easier advanced shooting modes you could use. In program mode, you can prevent the flash from firing automatically and instead raise your ISO to compensate for low light situations. Program mode can add to your creativity. It's a great place for beginners to start exploring the camera features. You also have aperture mode. Aperture mode will have control over setting the aperture or f-stop. The aperture size has a direct impact on the brightness of a photograph, with a larger aperture letting in more light into the camera compared to a smaller one. However, that isn't the only thing an aperture does. The other more important impact is depth of field. Again, that's that area of sharpness. This means that you can control both the amount of light that comes through the lens and the depth of field. This mode is particularly useful if you're concerned about having control over the amount of image that's in focus and are photographing a stationary image that won't be affected by the shutter speed. You've also got shutter priority mode. Shutter priority mode can be used when you're trying to freeze fast-moving objects. It's also ideal for times when you want to use long exposure. You'll have control over the shutter speed, and the camera will set the approximate aperture and ISO setting for you. It's especially useful for sports and wildlife photography. And there's manual mode. This is the mode that most professional photographers use most of the time, as it allows complete control over the camera functions. Manual mode means that you can adjust all functions to suit lighting conditions and other factors. Manual mode requires a good understanding of the relationships between those different functions. So creative control. DSLR mirrorless camera will also give you more creative control when it comes to exposure. You'll have absolute control over your shutter speed, aperture, and ISO settings so that you can create those beautiful blurred waterfalls or bokeh backgrounds. Smartphones can simulate a lot of those scenarios, like with portrait mode, but they're only as good as the software AI that's used to achieve any kind of effect. Some other advantages is the ability to be able to shoot in a RAW file format, which actually captures more data than the standard JPEG. Again, you can adjust your white balance or color temperature. You've got better autofocus and control. You're actually composing in a viewfinder, which is WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get, versus trying to use your phone screen. Noise reduction and a removable flash are also important for DSLR photographers. So, smartphone versus DSLR cameras. So now let's compare them. So this is exactly the same sunrise scene. The image on the left was shot in standard photo mode on an iPhone 12 Max Pro. The image on the right was a Nikon D810 with a 28mm lens. You can see that the iPhone standard photo mode is trying to balance the light and dark areas versus the DSLR, where the photographer is compensating the exposure for the lighting conditions. So you'll notice that there's more definition in the midtones on the image on the right. If we take a closer look at it, you'll also notice that there's a loss of detail with trying to get that balance that you don't see to the image on the right. You're also not getting as much noise in the shadowed areas. Shooting wildlife with a smartphone is a really bad idea, I just want to say. But there really isn't any comparison, because the smartphone camera just doesn't have the reach of a telephoto lens. So the image on the left was taken with an iPhone 8 Plus using the telephoto zoom leap feature. and the image on the right was taken with a 300mm telephoto lens. If you blow it up, it's a disaster on the left. So obviously, we're not going to be doing wildlife photography on our smartphone. Let's compare portrait photography. Both of these images were shot indoors, and you can already see how much better the exposure and the dynamic range is with the image on the right. And again, if we blow them up, you can see there's a whole lot more detail to the image on the right than in the left. There's also still some noise in there. So if we're doing nighttime photography, the image on the left was shot with the iPhone 12 Max Pro using night mode. It did a pretty good job with the exposure. You can still see though that some of the blacks aren't black and the midtones are kind of flat. So the image on the right taken with the Nikon D810 has a good color range from black to light. Again, if we blow those up, noise is the problem in the dark areas with the smartphone image, as well as the people walking are blurry because it's movement. Architecture, both phones are good at capturing architectural photos. The mirrorless camera image is on the right, the cell phone on the left. Once we enlarge it though, you can again see the blowout of the detail on the smartphone versus we still have strong detail with the mirrorless camera. Shooting indoors. The most significant and obvious distinction between the smartphone and the mirrorless camera here is that the way the cameras handled the bright sunlight. You can see on the smartphone image on the left that some of the detail was blown out by the light. If we blow that up, you really see the difference. There's so much more detail with the mirrorless. So let's review. We have lens versatility. So despite how far smartphones have come, they can't compare with the versatility of interchangeable lenses. Digital cameras have the options of hundreds of lenses, from wide angle to tilt shift, to telephotos to prime, where the smartphones are restricted to roughly a 28mm lens with AI. Sensor size. We know that sensor size is a big differentiator between digital camera and the smartphone. Smartphones have artificial intelligence tricked to mimic the zoom and bokeh effect, but these are, and all AI is only as good as the software that produces the image. So image quality. Image quality, simply put, digital camera produces a far cleaner and crisper image, largely due to the higher resolution. Higher resolution means more pixels per inch, which means more color, more detail, and more clarity. Modern mirrorless cameras are able to achieve resolutions of over 100 megapixels, but modern flagship smartphones cannot even come close to. Often a photo on a smartphone can look great, then when you try to print it, the quality degrades significantly. Where digital cameras support uncompressed raw files, smartphones tends to capture images in compressed formats such as JPEGs. For phones that support raw images, they require plenty of storage space, as these images are uncompressed and larger in size, which isn't always ideal on a smartphone. And customization, if the versatility of the wide range of lenses isn't enough, then the different available settings should be. From changing the aperture to focal length and shutter speed, digital cameras offer options that smartphones will never be able to mimic. With settings on smartphone cameras, the response is mostly controlled by the processor, which takes an intelligent guess at what the final image should look like. Controlling the camera settings causes a direct effect, which is particularly helpful when shooting in manual mode and looking at very specific shooting style. So nighttime shooting. The main reason smartphones will never be able to compete with cameras unless they suddenly drastically increase in size, it's because they'll never be able to match the size of the sensor found in a standard camera. So the larger the sensor, again, the more light it can pick up. For smartphones, specific features such as internet connectivity are now being integrated into modern standard cameras, particularly the mirrorless cameras with Wi-Fi and Bluetooth commonplace now. So despite the advantages in smartphone camera capability, there are certain aspects of digital cameras that can never be replicated, which is why the industry remains strong and the choice for both amateurs and professional photographers. So for those looking for an easy and compact camera solution, the smartphone will do. For others looking for control, better quality images, and greater versatility, then a digital camera will make all the difference. So let's take a look at a few more images captured with a standard camera. This image, this still life was shot with a specialty lens. It's called a Lens Baby. It's a Lens Baby Velvet 56. This image was processed using selective color. This image was a double exposure, so there's one image for the flower and one image for the condensation on the glass. It was actually shot in the camera, not processed that way. Here's another image that was shot with a specialty lens just to manipulate the bokeh in the background. And this image was shot with a telephoto lens with some creative editing. And this image was shot on a tripod using an extremely long shutter speed. So is a smartphone good enough to meet your photographic needs? In the end, it comes down to three main things: your expectation of image quality, how much control over things like exposure and lens choice you need, and what you'll be doing with your images once you've taken them. There's nothing that says you can't have your cake and eat it too, also, because I shoot with my smartphone and my regular camera, and a lot of times I'm using my smartphone just for the location access. So really the choice is yours. Once you choose, you start thinking about your photography in a different way, and you may start asking yourself, so, what makes a good photo? It's possible to have the best gear that technology has to answer and still kind of have lackluster images. So this is where composition comes in, and Michael Jack is gonna talk to you about composition.
Okay, as Susan said, I'll talk a little bit about composition, and basically what I'm going to cover is relevant regardless whether you use a DSLR, mirrorless, or a smartphone. So composition is something that is in almost every photographic article, book, social media. So it must be relevant and important. It at the end of the day, it boils down to visual appeal. A good composition is analogous to a musical melody versus cacophony of a toddler banging on a keyboard. So it's something that's pleasing to the eye, and it seems to fit together just like a melody versus having a bunch of different objects, in essence, banging against your eye. You can't have a really technically tack sharp, noise free, no grain, correctly exposed image of the most wonderful subject in the world. And if it's not, if it's poorly composed, then you really lose the attraction of the image. So it's not to say that being technically good is not important. It is important elements of a good photograph, and modern cameras can address many of the technical aspects, but it's the eye of the photographer that really creates the composition. So what we're going to talk about are a few of the basics, some of the rules of composition. And once you know the basics and the rules, then there will be times when you think it's more appropriate to break them. And that's good. That means you're progressing. The primary consideration is, how do you want your viewer's eyes to navigate the photo, to see what you want them to see or you want them to feel. So it's a storage or an image or a place or something like that. You want your viewer to really appreciate what caused you to take the image. So there are several guidelines to help you do that, starting with the rule of thirds. You can see the list here. We'll briefly touch on all of these. This is basically an overview. We're not going to go into a lot of depth on any of one of these, but if you're new to composition, these will give you some things to think about to get started. The rule of thirds is probably the most basic compositional guideline. It's derived from something called the golden ratio. The golden ratio was derived by artists and architects eons ago. If you think about the Parthenon, it's constructed in the golden ratio of 1 to about 1.6, and it's considered a dimension that's just pleasing to the eye. It just feels right. We approximated in photographic composition by essentially dividing an image into thirds horizontally and vertically, just like a tic-tac-toe grid, and placing important visual elements at or near the intersections of the line. These are called power points because objects there seem to carry more energy and interest in the image. The rule of thirds provides a sense of balance and dynamism, easy for me to say, avoids a static, boring image. So it's really more engaging to the eye, and it draws on the way we naturally view images. So example here, the image on the left, the bird is in the middle. So I think looking at that, you would say, yeah, it's a bird on a post, and then move on to the next picture. If you use the rule of thirds, then the post is on a third, the bird is on a PowerPoint. So I think if you look at that image, you would spend more time on it. It's the bird's looking into the image. You have more of a sense of place, and some room for the bird to move into. So it just adds a bit more dynamic feel to the image. Another example, the leaves are basically on a third line. The flowers are near the PowerPoints. And one rule I didn't mention is that odd numbers are more pleasing to the eye, to the brain, than the even numbers. So 3 is more appealing to the eye than 2 or 4. So it's something to keep in mind when you're looking at something like flowers. This image, the sun's coming through on a PowerPoint, so it has room to shine through the image. And if you can just imagine this, if it were in the center of the image, it'd just be a bright sun and be a much more boring image. And then again, the landscape shots, the trees, the one tree near a PowerPoint, and the ground also on another third line. And then to reinforce that point, when you take an image, and especially a landscape image, you're really telling your viewers what you think is most important. So in this case, you're saying the sky is more important because that takes up 2/3 of the image. So another way of thinking about the rule of thirds. The golden spiral, it's also based on the golden mean. If you divide a rectangle increasingly smaller using the golden mean ratio, and then draw a curved line through each of the rectangles, you'd end up with a spiral that really follows the form of a seashell. So it's since it's on the golden mean, it's called the golden spiral. And that's another way of adding interest to your images. So this is one example of a staircase that's winding down that tends to follow the golden spiral. Framing, this is using naturally occurring elements to frame a subject and keep it isolated. It really forms a boundary around the edges of the image, so it keeps your eye from wandering off out of the photograph. So in this case, the timbers surround the beer bottle collection and some other older artifacts, so that keeps your eye in. And in this image, the tree trunk, the trees, and the rocks keep your eyes in the image and focus on your grapevines. Leading lines, they can be straight, curved, can be applied, implied, geometric. It's anything that draws the eye into an image and guides it, and you really want it to guide it to the subject. So it keeps the eye from wandering aimlessly around in a photograph, and your eyes do wander around in a photograph quite a bit, looking for areas of contrast or lines to lead the eye somewhere. So using lines creates interest, and it guides the eye to what you want the viewer to see on the image. So in this case, the pews and the top of the structure really leads the eye all the way down to the altar, which is the subject of this photograph. In this one, the lines of the road lead to the tree, which is the subject of the photograph. So your eyes naturally tend to enter the image from the left side, because that's how we read as Westerners, and then tends to follow the lines to wherever they lead to. And in this one, this is a street in Italy, but the lines formed by the paving just leads the eye through the image. And finally, the line of the pier leads to the building at the end of the wharf. Filling the frame. This is a process of giving a subject prominence in the frame and eliminating or minimizing the background. So what you're really trying to do is eliminate distractions. You've all heard about the telephone pole that's sticking out of somebody's head. So you do, filling the frame with a picture of the person would help eliminate that, but you also want to look for distractions as you're taking an image. So this image of the flower eliminates the distractions of other plants or maybe other structures around. This is an image of a part of a building. So the focus is really on the unusual part of the architecture here, and not on other parts of the building, which would be a door, rose glass, things like that, which would be distracting and take away from the unusual architecture here. And another example of really focusing in on a flower and trying to eliminate other distractions. The concept of symmetry. We've talked about the rule of thirds, so this seems to be somewhat counter to that. But this is when you have a really strong central subject for a scene that is really interesting in itself. So you can center a dominant subject when other elements of the scene do not add context or interest, and when distracting elements may be present. So the difference, again, between this and a rule of thirds is with the rule of thirds, you might have other elements of an image that do add context and do add interest, and that's why you would use the rule of thirds. But if you have a strong central subject, you would really place that in the center and make the image about that. So this is all about the tree. It's not about the environment of the tree or anything else. It's just a beautifully backlit tree. This is the concept of a mirror image. So almost perfect reflections in the water. So this, with the rule of thirds, you wouldn't put the horizon line close to the middle, but in this one, you would to get the effect of symmetry. Patterns, they can be from nature, created by humans. They're everywhere if you look for them. You look for a sense of rhythm, but a break in the pattern can add interest. So these yellow netting form a pattern, but it's broken by a lighter color rope and then some other orange elements of the netting. This one, the patterns are the shingles, but it's broken by a red door. Balance is a little different than symmetry. It refers to the presence of a secondary point of interest that serves as a counterweight or balance to the main subject. So a point of interest may be a solid object or a feature. It could be darkness or light. It could be color or a geometric shape. So for example, on the left, you have the really heavy trees and the limbs, but color is a strong attraction to the eye, and especially a red color, very warm color, stands out. So in this case, you have the very warm colors balancing the heaviness of the trees. And this one, you have an individual walking out of the image, which is kind of unbalanced, but by serendipity, there's a seagull that's just flying the opposite direction. That's really highlighted against the sunlit sea stack. So it adds a counterpoint to the image. So lets the eye go back and forth and stay within the image. Shapes, in addition to lines, triangles really denote completeness and strength, and circles, squares, and rectangles can add interest to an image as well. So in this case, a very strong triangle. In this case, again the sea stacks with a triangular form add a sense of strength to this image. And then an image of the church, the beams inside the window plus the general shape of the window itself, and then the room it's in, all triangular shapes offer a lot of interest and strength to this image. Depth of field, Susan touched on this. That's really the area of sharpness in an image. So you can use a narrow depth of field to isolate a main subject from non-important or distracting background. And you can use a wide depth of field to allow the eye to enjoy a whole scene. So Control of depth of field is necessary to create the type of image you want the viewer to see. So in this case, the interest was on the iris, and everything else becomes blurred in this part of the background. So the subject here is clear, and same here. The subject is the radiator cap. The background is blurred, but there's enough context to let you know that it's in a series of old cars. In this one, you really wanted a sharp depth of field for the viewer to enjoy the whole scene. It's about the grandeur of the mountain range and the trees, the forest in the foreground. And the same here. You want the viewer to really be able to enjoy the whole scene and be able to allow the eye to go from the foreground all the way to the background, which is sharp, and allows the viewer to really, in essence, feel like they're at the scene. What we're not talking about is color. That's another presentation that's about as long as this one. So we just wanted to cover some of the fundamental composition basics. Obviously, they can be mixed. You think about the rules as you're taking image and try to build on those, but you can move on to your own artistic style. Recommend that you go to websites or places like Instagram, look at galleries of photographers, and you'll see some that you really like. You like the style, and you can think about those. Think about compositional techniques. Think about processing techniques. You know, how much saturation are they? What rules of composition were used? Where did the photographer place his camera? All those kinds of things. And a really good book on composition is one, Visual Flow by Ian Plant. It's an ebook. It's about 260 pages, I think, but it's extremely well illustrated and a very easy read. It's a very powerful book on composition. So composition is, again, the arrangement of parts of works of art, sort of form a unified, harmonious whole. Again, thinking about the melody, is it something that's generally pleasing to the eye and flows. So we realize this is a recording. So if you have any questions or comments, you can email the Riviera Camera Club at gmail.com, or you can contact me at dmichael.jack@gmail.com. So hopefully you've enjoyed the presentation tonight, picked up a few things that will help you in your photography, and good luck on choosing to continue with your smartphone or stepping up to DSLR or mirrorless camera.